The morning sun was just starting to shine through the big windows of the Harrington mansion when Grace Mitchell heard the soft crying coming from upstairs. She put down the wooden spoon she was using to stir the porridge and listened carefully. After working in this house for 18 months, she knew every sound that came from young Samuel's room. This crying was different from his usual morning sounds. It was deeper, more desperate, like something inside him was breaking apart. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and walked quietly up the grand staircase, her footsteps making no noise. On the expensive carpet that probably cost more than she made in 6 months, Samuel Harrington was 11 years old and had been born with cerebral palsy that affected his legs and made walking very difficult. His father, Vincent Harrington, was one of the richest men in Chicago, owning 12 luxury hotels across the country. But all that money couldn't buy what Samuel needed most: someone who understood him. Someone who saw past his wheelchair and leg braces to the brilliant, lonely boy trapped inside a body that didn't work the way other kids' bodies did. Grace found Samuel in his room, trying desperately to stand up from his wheelchair, his thin arms shaking with effort as tears rolled down his pale cheeks. The physical therapist had canceled again, the 3rd time this month, and Samuel had been trying to practice his exercises alone. Grace's heart broke seeing him struggle like this, and without thinking, she rushed to his side and gently helped him back into his chair. "It's okay, sweet boy," Grace said softly, using the same voice she used with her own grandson back in Mississippi. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm here now." Samuel looked up at her with eyes that held so much pain for someone so young. "Nobody ever stays," he whispered. "They all leave when they see how broken I am. Even my dad can't stand to look at me for more than 5 minutes." Grace felt anger rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. She had seen how Vincent treated his son like a problem to be managed, a broken investment that couldn't be fixed with money. The man spent more time in board meetings than he did with Samuel, and when he was home, he barely spoke to the boy except to ask about his grades or doctor appointments. Grace had been hired as a cook 18 months ago after the previous chef quit without notice. She had been desperate for work after her husband died and left her with medical bills that ate up their entire savings. At 52 years old, with no formal culinary training beyond what her grandmother taught her in their small kitchen in Jackson, she thought she would never get the job. But Vincent had been in a hurry, barely looked at her resume, and hired her on the spot when she cooked him a simple meal that reminded him of something from his childhood. Since then, she had kept her head down, cooked the meals, and tried not to get involved with the family drama. But watching Samuel suffer in silence day after day had slowly broken down the walls she built around her heart. "You know what my grandma used to tell me when I felt broken?" Grace asked, settling into the chair beside Samuel's wheelchair. "She said that broken things can still be beautiful. Like the Japanese art, where they fix broken pottery with gold, the cracks become part of the beauty, not something to hide." Samuel wiped his eyes and looked at her curiously. "But I can't be fixed with gold. The doctors say I'll never walk normally. I'll always need help. I'll always be different." Grace reached over and gently took his hand. "Different doesn't mean less valuable, baby. You've got a mind sharper than any child I've ever met. You play that piano like angels are guiding your fingers. You speak 3 languages at 11 years. Old, your legs might not work perfectly, but everything else about you shines so bright it could light up the whole world if people would just stop and look." For the first time in months, Samuel smiled a real smile, not the fake one he put on when his father's business partners visited. "Grace, would you... Would you help me practice standing? Not the exercises, just standing. I want to surprise my dad. His birthday is next week, and I want to stand up when he comes in. Maybe if he sees me trying, hell." The boy's voice trailed off. but Grace understood. Samuel thought if he could just be less disabled, less of a burden, maybe his father would love him more. It broke her heart because she knew that wasn't how love was supposed to work. Real love didn't have conditions or requirements. Real love accepted you exactly as you were. "Of course, I'll help you," Grace said, standing up and positioning herself in front of Samuel. "But not to impress your father. We're going to do this because you want to get stronger for yourself, okay? Your worth doesn't depend on whether you can stand or walk or run. You understand me?" Samuel nodded, and together they began the slow, difficult process of helping him stand. Grace supported most of his weight, her strong arms holding him steady, as his legs trembled with the effort. They had been practicing for about 10 minutes when Grace started humming an old gospel song her mother used to sing. Without thinking about it, she began to sway slightly to the rhythm, and Samuel, still holding on to her, swayed too. "What's that song?" Samuel asked, his voice strained from concentration but curious. "It's beautiful." Grace smiled and began to sing softly. "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water." As she sang, she continued to sway gently, and Samuel moved with her, his feet shuffling slightly on the floor. It wasn't really dancing, not in the traditional sense, but it was movement, and it was joyful. And for the first time in forever, Samuel laughed. Not a polite laugh or a forced laugh, but a real, deep belly laugh that filled the room with pure happiness. They were so caught up in their gentle dance that neither of them heard the footsteps in the hallway. Neither of them saw Vincent Harrington standing in the doorway, his face twisted with rage at the sight before him. In his mind, influenced by 3 glasses of whiskey from his lunch meeting and years of unchecked prejudice, he didn't see a kind woman helping his disabled son experience a moment of joy. He saw a black servant overstepping her boundaries, touching his son without permission, filling his head with what he would call inappropriate influences. The alcohol and his own inner demons transformed a beautiful moment into something ugly. In his eyes, "Get your filthy hands off my son right now." Vincent's voice exploded through the room like a bomb, causing the soft singing to stop immediately. Grace froze, still holding Samuel, who began to shake not from physical effort, but from fear. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees as Vincent stormed in. His expensive suit perfect as always, his face red with a fury that made him look like a stranger. "How dare you touch my son without permission? Dare you, Phil? His head with your ... your gospel nonsense." Vincent practically spat the words, his breath heavy with alcohol and rage. Grace carefully helped Samuel back into his wheelchair before turning to face Vincent. She kept her voice calm and steady, though inside she was seething with anger at his cruel words. "Mr. Harrington," Samuel was practicing his standing exercises. The physical therapist canceled again, and he asked for my help. But Vincent cut her off with a sharp gesture of his hand. "I don't want to hear your excuses. You're a cook, nothing more. You have no business being in my son's room, no business touching him, and certainly no business singing your people's songs to him." The racist undertone in his words was clear, and Grace felt each word like a slap to the face. "Dad, please," Samuel said, his voice small and frightened. Grace was just helping me. She's the only one who Vincent turned his cold gaze to his son, and Samuel immediately fell silent, shrinking back in his wheelchair. "You're confused, Samuel? This woman has overstepped every boundary. She's taking advantage of your condition. ... Vincent struggled to find the words, his alcohol-foggy brain grasping for accusations. "She's probably planning to sue us, claim some kind of injury from lifting you. These people always have an agenda." Grace stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, dignity radiating from every inch of her being, despite the humiliation being heaped upon her. She had faced racism before, many times in her 52 years, but hearing it spoken, so openly, so cruelly, in front of a child who she had grown to care about, made it hurt even more. "Mr. Harrington," she said quietly, "I have never asked for anything beyond my wages. I have never complained about the extra hours, the canceled days off, or the tasks beyond cooking that I've taken on. I helped Samuel because he needed help. And because, despite what you might think, I care about your son." Vincent's face grew even redder, and he took a threatening step toward Grace. "You care about my son. You barely know him. You're hired help, nothing more. And as of this moment, you're fired. Get out of my house immediately." The words hung in the air like poison, and Samuel let out a strangled sob. "No, Dad, you can't fire Grace. She's the only one who understands me. She's the only one who sees me as more than just my disability." But Vincent wasn't listening. He pulled out his wallet and threw several $100 bills on the floor at Grace's feet, the gesture deliberately degrading. "There's your severance pay," he said coldly. "Take it and get out. If I see you near my property or my son again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Grace looked at the money scattered on the floor, then at Samuel's tear-stained face. Then finally, at Vincent. Something shifted in her expression, a steel entering her eyes that made Vincent unconsciously step back. "Keep your money, Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice carrying a quiet power that filled the room. "I don't need it, but you should know something. Your son is brilliant, talented, and full of love. He practices standing for hours every day, not because the doctors tell him to, but because he wants to make you proud. He learns languages and plays piano and studies harder than any child should have to, all hoping that maybe, just maybe, if he's good enough, smart enough, accomplished enough, his father will spend 5 minutes actually seeing him." Grace walked to the door, then turned back one more time. "I've worked for wealthy families for 30 years, Mr. Harrington. I've seen neglect dressed up as providing, absence excused as working hard for the family. But I've never seen a man so blind to the treasure right in front of him. That boy loves you with everything he has, and you're so wrapped up in your own prejudice and pride that you can't even see it. One day you're going to wake up and realize what you've lost, but by then it might be too late." As Grace walked down the hallway, she heard Samuel calling after her, his voice broken with sobs. "Grace, Grace, please don't leave me. Please." The sound nearly shattered her resolve, but she kept walking. She had learned long ago that sometimes you had to leave to make people understand what they had lost. But this wasn't the end of Grace's story with the Harrington family. What happened over the next 2 weeks would change everything in ways that no one, especially Vincent Harrington, could have predicted. The first 3 days after Grace left were the worst. Samuel refused to eat anything the new cook prepared. A stern woman from France who spoke barely any English and had no interest in a disabled child's emotional needs. Vincent, still convinced he had done the right thing, threw himself into his work, avoiding his son's room entirely. He told himself Samuel would get over it, that children were resilient, that this was for the best. But late at night, when the whiskey couldn't drown out the sound of his son crying through the walls, doubt began to creep in. On the 4th day, Samuel's teacher called. The boy who never missed school, who always had perfect attendance despite his physical challenges, hadn't come to class? Vincent found him in his room, still in his wheelchair where the night nurse had left him, staring at nothing. "I practiced standing for 2 years, Samuel said without looking at his father. 2 years of pain and falling and getting back up. Do you know why?" Vincent didn't answer, uncomfortable with the conversation. "Because Grace told me that I was worth the effort, that I wasn't broken, just different." She was the first person who ever made me believe that maybe I could be something. More than the disabled son you're ashamed of." The words hit Vincent like physical blows, each one targeted perfectly at the walls he had built around his heart. "I'm not ashamed of you," he said automatically, but even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. Samuel finally looked at him, and the emptiness in his son's eyes was terrifying. "Yes, you are. You've been ashamed of me since the day the doctors said I'd never walk normally. You can't even look at me for more than 30 seconds without checking your phone or finding an excuse to leave. The only person who ever really saw me was Grace. And you fired her because she was black and you couldn't stand the sight of her helping me." Vincent wanted to deny it, to argue, but the truth of his son's words was undeniable. He had been ashamed, not just of Samuel's disability, but of his own inability to connect with his son. It was easier to throw money at the problem, to hire therapists and tutors and nurses, than to actually sit down and learn who Samuel really was. And when he saw Grace doing what he couldn't or wouldn't do, when he saw her making his son laugh and dance and feel normal, his shame had turned to rage. And he had lashed out in the ugliest way possible. On the 7th day, Vincent came home to find Samuel had somehow managed to drag himself out of his wheelchair and was lying on the floor of the music room, unable to get up. The new cook stood in the doorway, refusing to help because it wasn't her job to lift children. Vincent rushed to his son, his heart pounding with fear as he lifted Samuel's thin body. "What were you doing?" he asked, his voice shaking. Samuel looked at him with those empty eyes and said, "I wanted to play piano. It's the only thing that doesn't hurt anymore. But I couldn't get onto the bench by myself. Grace always helped me. She said music was like medicine for the soul." That night, Vincent sat in his study, surrounded by all his success, his awards, his wealth, and felt emptier than he ever had in his life. He had built an empire, but lost his soul in the process. He had gained the whole world, but was losing his son. The next morning, he did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He called in sick to work. Instead, he spent the day trying to find Grace Mitchell. It wasn't easy. She hadn't left a forwarding address, and her phone had been disconnected. But Vincent Harrington hadn't built his empire by giving up easily. He finally found her through a network of domestic workers, learning that she was staying with her sister on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood Vincent had never even driven through before. When he knocked on the door of the small, neat apartment, Grace's sister answered, her face immediately hardening when she recognized him. "Grace doesn't want to see you," she said firmly. "You've done enough damage." But Vincent didn't leave. He stood in that hallway for 3 hours until finally Grace herself came to the door. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the weight of what had happened had aged her. "What do you want, Mr. Harrington?" she asked, not inviting him in. Vincent had practiced his speech 100 times on the drive over, but standing there, facing the woman he had humiliated and insulted, all his words failed him. "Samuel won't eat," he said finally. "He won't go to school. He won't even play piano anymore. He just sits in his chair and stares at nothing. I don't know what to do." Grace studied him for a long moment, then said, "That's not my problem. Any more, Mr. Harrington? You made it very clear that I was just hired help, that I had no business caring about your son." Vincent's shoulders slumped in defeat. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I was wrong about everything. The way I spoke to you was unforgivable. The things I said, they came from a place of prejudice and fear that I'm ashamed to admit I carry. But please, I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for Samuel. He needs you." "No," Grace said firmly. "What Samuel needs is a father who sees him, who loves him exactly as he is, who doesn't view his disability as a failure or an embarrassment. He needs a father who will dance with him, even if that dance is just swaying in a wheelchair. He needs..." A father who will sit with him during his therapy, who will celebrate his small victories, who will hold him when he cries about the things he can't do. Can you be that father, Mr. Harrington? Because if you can't, then my coming back won't solve anything. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, then said something that surprised them both. I don't know how to be that father. I look at Samuel, and I see all my failures as a parent. I see the car accident that caused his cerebral palsy. The accident? That happened because I insisted his mother drive to my office party, even though she was tired. I see my wife dying in that accident while Samuel survived but damaged. I see my guilt, my shame, my inability to fix what I broke. And it's easier to stay away than to face all of that every time I look at him. For the first time since he had arrived, Grace's expression softened slightly. Mr. Harrington, Samuel doesn't need you to be perfect. He doesn't need you to fix him because he's not broken. He just needs you to show up, to try, to love him more than you fear your own inadequacy. She paused, then added, I'll come back. But not as just a cook. I come back as Samuel's aide, his tutor, his friend. And you have to be there too. You have to learn to be his father. Really be his father, not just the man who pays the bills. Vincent nodded quickly, hope flooding through him for the first time in days. Yes, anything. Whatever you need, whatever Samuel needs. Grace studied him for another long moment, then said, We start tomorrow, 8 o'clock sharp. And Mr. Harrington, if you ever speak to me or anyone else the way you did that day, I won't just leave. I'll make sure every newspaper in Chicago knows exactly what kind of man Vincent Harrington really is. The threat was delivered calmly, but Vincent knew she meant every word. The next morning, when Grace walked back into the Harrington mansion, Samuel was sitting in his chair in the foyer, having refused to move from the spot since the night nurse told him someone special was coming. When he saw Grace, his face lit up like a Christmas tree, and he began to cry. You came back, he sobbed as Grace knelt beside his chair and pulled him into a hug. You came back for me. Grace held him tight, her own eyes wet with tears. Of course I came back, baby. I told you, didn't I? Different doesn't mean less valuable. And you, Samuel Harrington, are the most valuable person in this whole big house. What happened over the next 6 months was nothing short of miraculous. True to his word, Vincent began showing up. At first, it was awkward and uncomfortable. He didn't know how to talk to his son, didn't know how to bridge the gulf that years of absence had created. But Grace was there, guiding both of them, teaching Vincent the same patience and unconditional acceptance she showed Samuel every day. She taught Vincent how to help Samuel with his exercises, how to support his weight without making him feel helpless, how to celebrate the small victories that meant everything to a boy fighting against his own body every day. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Vincent had come home early from work, something that was happening more and more often. He found Samuel and Grace in the music room, Samuel playing a complicated piece on the piano while Grace sang along. Without thinking, Vincent began to sing, too, his rusty baritone joining Grace's smooth alto. Samuel's hands stuttered on the keys for a moment in surprise, then continued playing, a huge smile spreading across his face. When the song ended, Samuel looked at his father and said, Dad, would you help me stand? I want to dance like Grace taught me. Vincent looked at Grace, who nodded encouragingly, and together they helped Samuel to his feet. Vincent supported his son's weight, feeling for the first time how hard Samuel worked just to remain upright, how much strength it took just to stand. Grace put on some soft jazz music, and the three of them swayed together, Samuel between the two adults who loved him most, his laughter filling the room like sunshine. This is what I wanted for my birthday, Samuel said softly. "Not for you to see me stand, but for us to stand together." Vincent felt something break inside him, all the walls and barriers crumbling as he held his son close. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words encompassing so much more than just that moment. "I'm so sorry for all the time I wasted being afraid." Samuel hugged him tighter and said, "It's okay, Dad. Grace says broken things can be beautiful when you fill the cracks with gold. Maybe we're like that. Maybe all the broken parts are what make us special." Vincent looked over Samuel's head at Grace, who was watching them with tears streaming down her face, and mouthed the words, "Thank you." But the story doesn't end there. What Vincent discovered in the months that followed changed not just his relationship with his son, but his entire perspective on life and success. He learned that Grace had a master's degree in child psychology that she had earned through night school, while working as a domestic worker to support her family. He learned that she had given up a scholarship to a PhD program when her husband got sick, choosing love over career advancement. He learned that the simple gospel songs he had dismissed were actually complex musical arrangements that had been passed down through generations, carrying history and resilience in every note. Vincent also learned about himself, facing truths that were painful but necessary. He realized that his prejudice wasn't just about race, but about class, about disability, about anything that didn't fit into his narrow definition of success and worth. He had built walls not just around his heart, but around his entire life, creating an echo chamber where only voices like his own could be heard. Grace and Samuel broke through those walls, showing him a world that was richer, more complex, and more beautiful than anything his limited perspective had allowed him to see. 6 months after Grace returned, Vincent did something that shocked Chicago's elite society. He established the Samuel Harrington Foundation for Children with Disabilities, with Grace Mitchell as its director. The foundation didn't just provide money for treatment, it provided support for families, training for caregivers, and most importantly, it worked to change perceptions about disability. At the launch event, Vincent stood before a crowd of his peers, many of whom had shared his prejudices, and told them the truth about what had happened in his home. "I nearly lost my son because I was too proud and too prejudiced to see the gift that was right in front of me," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "I fired the one person who saw my son's potential because the color of her skin made me uncomfortable with the truth she was showing me." Grace Mitchell saved my son's life, not from his disability, but from my ignorance. She taught us both that different doesn't mean less than, that needing help doesn't mean weak, and that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the people we dismiss as beneath us. The speech made headlines, not just because a billionaire admitted to racism and ableism, but because he backed his words with action. The foundation didn't just have Grace's name on the letterhead. She had full control, making decisions about programs and funding without needing Vincent's approval. It was a level of trust and respect that spoke louder than any apology could. And at the center of it all was Samuel, who had begun to thrive in ways no doctor had predicted, with consistent support from both Grace and his father. Samuel's physical therapy progressed beyond anyone's expectations. He would never walk without assistance, but he grew stronger, more confident, more willing to push his boundaries. He began speaking at schools about disability awareness, his eloquence and humor changing minds in ways that pamphlets and lectures never could. "My legs don't work perfectly," he would tell audiences, "but my heart works just fine, and my brain works even better. I'm not inspiring because I'm disabled. I'm inspiring because I'm human, just like you." The day Samuel turned 13, 2 years after that fateful afternoon when Vincent had exploded in rage, the three of them stood together in the mansion's ballroom. It had been transformed into a celebration space, filled with children from the foundation's programs all dancing or moving in whatever way their bodies allowed. Vincent and Grace stood on either side of Samuel, supporting him as he swayed to the music, his leg braces gleaming under the lights. "You know what gives me goosebumps?" Samuel said to his father, using the phrase that had become their inside joke. This, all of this. Kids who were told they couldn't dance, dancing. Parents who were afraid to hope, hoping. And you, Dad, the man who once couldn't look at me, now holding me up. Vincent kissed the top of his son's head, no longer caring that tears were streaming down his face in front of all these people. "You want to know what gives me goosebumps?" he replied. "Knowing that I almost missed this. Knowing that my prejudice and fear almost cost me the two most important people in my life." He looked at Grace, who had become so much more than an employee. She had become family, the grandmother figure Samuel had never had, the wisdom Vincent had never thought to seek. "Grace, that day when I said those terrible things, when I threw money at your feet like you were nothing, you could have destroyed me. You could have sued, gone to the media, ruined my reputation. Why didn't you?" Grace smiled, her eyes warm with the wisdom of someone who had seen too much harm to add to it unnecessarily. "Because, Mr. Harrington, revenge would have felt good. For a moment, but it wouldn't have helped Samuel. And that boy, your beautiful, brilliant boy, deserved better than to be collateral damage in adult battles. I knew that somewhere under all that anger and prejudice was a man who loved his son, but didn't know how to show it. I had faith that love would win, eventually. It always does if you give it enough time and enough chances." As the music played and the children danced in their own unique ways, filling the ballroom with joy and laughter, Vincent understood something profound. Success wasn't measured in money or power or societal position. Success was measured in moments. Like this, when love transcended prejudice, when acceptance overcame fear, when three people who should never have become family created something beautiful from something broken. The millionaire who had once seen his black cook dance with his disabled son and reacted with rage now stood with them, dancing the same dance, understanding finally that this unconditional love, this chosen family, this hard-won harmony, this was what gave everyone goosebumps. The story of Vincent, Samuel, and Grace became legend in Chicago. Told in boardrooms and classrooms, in churches and community centers. It was a story about how prejudice can blind us to angels in our midst, how pride can cost us the very treasures we claim to protect, and how redemption is possible for anyone willing to face their own darkness. But most of all, it was a story about dance, not the dance of perfect bodies moving in perfect synchronization, but the dance of imperfect people choosing to move together despite their differences, supporting each other's weight, catching each other when they fall, and creating something beautiful from their shared vulnerability. 5 years later, when Samuel gave his valedictorian speech at his high school graduation, standing at the podium with the support of his custom braces, he looked out at the audience and found his father and Grace sitting together in the front row. "They say it takes a village to raise a child," he began, his voice strong and clear. "But sometimes it just takes two people brave enough to see past their own limitations. Father once saw my caregiver, Grace Mitchell, dancing with me, and reacted with anger born from fear and prejudice. Today, that same man and that same woman sit together as my family, proof that love can transform even the deepest wounds into the strongest bonds." He paused, looking directly at them. The title of my story could have been The Millionaire Saw his black cook dance with his disabled son and fired her. That would have been a tragedy. Instead, the title is The Millionaire Saw His Black Cook Dance with His Disabled Son. What he did gave people goosebumps, not because of the initial reaction, but because of what came after, because of the courage it took to admit wrong, the strength it took to change, and the love it took to build something beautiful from something broken. That's what gives people goosebumps. Not perfection, but the perfect effort to become better than we were yesterday. As Samuel finished his speech to thunderous applause, Vincent and Grace stood together, tears streaming down both their faces. They had started as employer and employee, divided by race, class, and prejudice. They had become something more, a family forged, not by blood, but by choice, not by perfection, but by the willingness to grow. And as they watched Samuel walk across that stage to receive his diploma, his steps uncertain but determined, supported by his braces but not defined by them, they knew that this was what really mattered. Not the money, not the mansion, not the societal position, but this moment, this young man, this transformed life that they had all played a part in shaping. The Harrington Mansion still stands in Chicago, but it's different now. It's no longer a symbol of isolated wealth, but a beacon of inclusion. The kitchen where Grace once cooked alone is now filled with laughter as she teaches cooking classes to children with disabilities. The music room where Samuel once played alone now hosts concerts where young musicians of all abilities perform together. And the ballroom where Vincent once entertained only the elite now opens its doors to anyone who needs to be reminded that different doesn't mean less than. That broken can be beautiful, and that sometimes the most unlikely people can create the most extraordinary families. Grace Mitchell continued to work with the Harrington family, but her role evolved far beyond anything that could be captured in a job title. She became Samuel's honorary grandmother, Vincent's trusted advisor, and a nationally recognized advocate for disability rights and racial justice. She never forgot the humiliation of that day when Vincent had thrown money at her feet, but she transformed that pain into purpose, using her story to help others understand that dignity isn't determined by job titles or skin color, but by the content of one's character and the depth of one's compassion. Vincent Harrington remained a successful businessman, but his definition of success fundamentally changed. He began measuring his achievements not in dollars earned, but in lives transformed. He became known for hiring people with disabilities, for promoting diversity at every level of his companies, and for using his platform to challenge the prejudices he once held. His relationship with Samuel became the cornerstone of his life, and he never missed a therapy session, a school event, or an opportunity to dance with his son, no matter how busy his schedule. And Samuel grew up to become a disability rights lawyer, a concert pianist, and a motivational speaker whose TED Talk about the power of inclusive love has been viewed over 50 million times. But more importantly, he grew up to become a man who understood that his worth wasn't despite his disability, but inclusive of it. That his story wasn't about overcoming cerebral palsy, but about overcoming the prejudices that would have limited his life more than any physical condition ever could. The last scene of this story takes place 20 years after that first dance. Samuel, now 31, stands at his wedding, supported by his custom-designed exoskeleton that helps him walk. His father stands as his best man, and Grace, now in her 70s but still vibrant, sits in the front row as his honored grandmother. As the music begins for the father-son dance, Vincent helps Samuel onto the dance floor, and they begin to sway together, just as they had learned all those years ago. Halfway through the song, Grace joins them, and the three of them dance together. A family that shouldn't exist according to society's rules, but does exist according to love's laws. The wedding guests watch with tears in their eyes, many of them recording the moment on their phones. Later, the video goes viral with the caption, "The millionaire saw his black cook dance with his disabled son." What happened next gave everyone goosebumps. But for Vincent, Samuel, and Grace, it wasn't about the viral moment or the public recognition. It was about the private victory of three people who chose love over fear, acceptance over prejudice, and family over convention. It was about understanding that the most beautiful dances aren't performed by perfect bodies, but by imperfect people choosing to support each other through every stumble, every fall, and every triumphant rise. As the music faded and the applause thundered through the reception hall, Samuel whispered to his father and Grace, "Thank you for teaching me to dance." And they knew he wasn't just talking about the physical movement, but about the dance of life itself. Messy, complicated, sometimes painful, but ultimately beautiful when you have the right partners to hold you up. That's what gave people goosebumps. Not the spectacle of difference overcome, but the simple, profound truth that love, real love, sees no color, recognizes no disability, acknowledges no barrier that it cannot eventually, patiently, certainly overcome. The story ends where it began, in a mansion in Chicago, but everything has changed. The walls that once divided have become bridges that connect. The prejudice that once poisoned has been replaced by understanding that heals. And the dance that once caused division now creates unity, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen not in the streets, but in the hearts of individuals brave enough to admit they were wrong and strong enough to become better. This is the story of how a millionaire saw his black cook dance with his disabled son. And what he did next didn't just give people goosebumps, it gave them hope that change is possible, that families can be chosen, and that love, in the end, really does conquer all.